Donald Trump is losing the trade war against China, which he himself started. Trump held an important meeting with China's president, Xi Jinping, in South Korea on the 30th of October, and they came to a new agreement which essentially amounted to a one-year truce in the US trade war. Now, in a few minutes here, I will look at the exact details of this agreement, and I will further discuss issues like Trump's tariffs on China and China's export restrictions on rare earths. I will also look at the trade between US and China, especially agricultural trade and China's exports of advanced technologies. And I will look at how China has been catching up in some cutting-edge high-tech sectors, especially semiconductors. But the main takeaway from all of this is that although this is not the end of the trade war, it's only a one-year truce, Donald Trump has clearly lost this battle in the trade war. China has won this battle. As the Financial Times put it, China is emerging as a U.S. peer rival at the Xi Jinping-Donald Trump summit. The FT noted that when Trump first started the trade war on China back in his first term as U.S. president, it actually surprised Beijing. However, the FT noted, quote, "This time, a better prepared and economically more powerful China has been able to fight its once far mightier opponent to a standstill," end quote. The FT noted that there were at least 3 examples of how China was able to defend itself and fight back in this trade war that Donald Trump started. First of all, Trump increased tariffs on China to 145% as an act of shock and awe. This was a kind of nuclear trade war, and Trump thought that China would give in and surrender. On the contrary, China defended itself and hit back with the exact same level of reciprocal tariffs, which freaked out the United States, and it backed down. Then the second example of China fighting back was when China put export controls on rare earths. And later I will show how China dominates the global production and processing of rare earth elements. That also freaked out the US because US industry relies very heavily on Chinese rare earths, and Trump once again was forced to back down. And then the US government extended export controls not only on semiconductors, but also to thousands of subsidiaries of Chinese companies. And in response to this, China tightened its controls on rare earths, which once again forced the US to back down. Unlike any other country on earth, Trump has been waging war on dozens of countries. China is the only one that was able to actually fight back and defend itself against the US and prevent Trump from imposing an unequal treaty. And this is why an analyst at the major European bank BNP Paribas wrote the following: "The United States is accepting that, quote, it is now dealing with a peer rival capable of imposing material economic harm on it, a relatively new position for the US, and a development which, at least to us, confirms China's ascendancy to global economic superpower status," end quote. That is the money quote today. China is officially an economic superpower, and the US empire cannot bully around Beijing and try to force it to do what it wants, like the US has done with its so-called allies in Europe and South Korea and other countries. China was not willing to be bullied by the US. However, with that said, I emphasized earlier that this is only a battle in a larger trade war that is going to continue. It is certainly not the end. And the FT made it clear that further US-China tensions are inevitable. They noted that most of the agreements between Xi and Trump were relatively narrow, and they mostly suspended existing punitive measures, but did not scrap them altogether. The FT quoted a Chinese scholar who said, quote, "This summit can only bring about a tactical detente rather than a strategic reset for the US-China relations," end quote. And I agree. This is a detente. It's a temporary truce. It is not the end at all. Now let's discuss what exactly was agreed to in this Xi-Trump meeting in South Korea. Here is the so-called scorecard that was kept by Bloomberg. So 1, the US agreed to lower its fentanyl-related tariffs from 20% to 10%. The US is also suspending the 50% expansion of its US entity list, which is basically a form of sanctions targeting Chinese companies. Trump is backing away from the 100% tariff threat on China, and the US is suspending ship fees. Those were the US concessions. On the other side, China is giving up its rare earth controls, and China is going to resume buying American soybeans, although China was already buying those soybeans before. So this is not really a new concession made by China. And maybe China will agree to buy energy from the US. That's what Trump floated, but there's not actually an agreement on that yet. That's a hypothetical. And then finally, China agreed to crack down on the export of chemicals that are used to make fentanyl, although China already had some restrictions on that. And maybe there will be some kind of agreement on TikTok, but again, this is not clear. It's completely ambiguous. So in reality, China is not making very many concessions, which is why, as Bloomberg put it, China is giving up less than what the US gave up. Bloomberg concludes that China won this round of the trade war. This was also the conclusion of the Associated Press. As the AP put it, the deal between the US and China is undoing the damage of a self-inflicted trade war. The AP quoted an influential economist at a prestigious US university, Cornell, who said, quote, "It is hard to see what major gains the US has made in the bilateral relationship relative to where things stood before Trump took office," end quote. So basically, after months and months of Trump escalating against China and attacking China, we're back to square one. We're basically back to January when Trump entered office again. Now, this is quite funny because if we go back to April, when Trump massively escalated the trade war on China, Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, claimed that the US had all the cards and China was playing with a, quote, losing hand, end quote. He claimed that the US had so much leverage over China and that Beijing would completely surrender amid Trump's threats. That's clearly the exact opposite of what has happened since then. I remember making videos back then in which I argued and looked at a lot of evidence that I'll review today. I showed that actually the US is more dependent on China than vice versa. And this is not 2000. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, China was very dependent on trade with the United States. But in the past 2 decades, China has significantly reduced its dependence on trade with the US and export to the US market. And today, the US only represents around 10% of China's overall trade. And China represents around 11% of the US overall trade. But China still has some clear advantages. When I was doing my original analysis back in April when Trump launched this new phase of the trade war, I analyzed what exactly the US exports to China and what China exports to the US. And you can see that the most important goods that China exports to the US include many technologies that the US simply cannot produce, like cell phones and computers and electric batteries and electrical transformers and other electrical machinery and car parts. We're no longer in the 1990s or early 2000s when the majority of China's exports to the US were low value added goods like furniture and toys and household appliances. China has very quickly moved up the global value chain. And the reality is that the US simply cannot replace many of these technologies that it imports from China. Now, if you look at what the US exports to China, on the other hand, yes, the US does export a few high-tech goods that China cannot replace, especially integrated circuits, advanced semiconductors. However, many of the other goods that the US exports to China can easily be replaced. This includes things like crude petroleum and gas and soybeans and corn. These are commodities that many other countries produce. China can import them from somewhere else. The US did used to export cars to China, but now China has become the world's #1 producer of cars. and most people in China prefer buying cars from Chinese companies because they're cheaper and they're of better quality. So the reality is that overall, the US is more dependent on trade with China. Now, many people in the Trump administration, like Bessent and Trump himself, think that the economy of China today is like the economy of China in the 80s and 90s, when China was making very low value added, labor intensive goods of low quality. China has massively boosted its technological capabilities, and today China is the world's manufacturing superpower, leading in the vast majority of industries. This is why the Financial Times published a report in which it concluded that China exports a lot of advanced tech to the US that the US cannot source from anywhere else. And the FT published this chart using data from Harvard showing how the US is actually dependent on importing high-value tech, including machinery, telecommunications equipment, vehicles, and semiconductors, and also a lot of machine parts that it cannot get from anywhere else, whereas China imports a lot of fuel, energy from the US, which it can get from many other countries. So what we've seen over the past 2 decades is that the Chinese government has used industrial policy, state-led development policies, and planning, central planning, in order to move up the global value chain and increase its technological self-sufficiency so it's no longer as dependent on the US. So in the past 20 years, China has become less reliant on exporting to the US market, while at the same time, US industry has become much more reliant on importing inputs, industrial inputs from China, which are needed for the advanced manufacturing in the US. Economists at the firm Gavekal concluded that the US is more reliant on inputs from China in all of the following industries: agriculture, manufacturing, including electronics, motor vehicles, and machinery, utilities, construction, services, and in general, the whole economy average. And yet, despite all of this evidence, top US officials simply drank the Kool-Aid. They believed in their own propaganda. They believed that China's economy was a basket case and that, as Scott Bessent said, the US had all the cards. China was playing with a losing hand. China is completely dependent on access to the US market, exporting to the US market. In reality, if you look at data in most Chinese industry, the vast majority of revenue comes from domestic purchases. Yes, China is dependent on exporting electronics, especially consumer electronics. But overall, in the vast majority of China's industries, it is actually domestic revenue that makes up the vast majority of overall revenue. And even when you look at the export revenue in aggregate, the US does represent an important part, but it's still only a minority of the overall export revenue. And there are other countries around the world. Even if China is simply exporting to Vietnam or Mexico or Indonesia or Thailand, and then maybe companies in those countries are adding a bit more value to the product and then exporting it to the US, it doesn't matter. Chinese exporters are only concerned about selling the good. They don't care if it ultimately goes to the US. They just want to sell it. And this is actually, by the way, good for countries like Vietnam and Mexico and Indonesia that are developing their own manufacturing sector and taking advantage of the US trade war against China. So what this shows overall is that this is why the US has been losing the trade war against China that Donald Trump started. And of course, it was continued by Joe Biden and the Democrats. This is bipartisan. It's not just Trump. But now that Trump is in his second term as US president, he massively escalated the trade war on China, and he believed the propaganda claiming that the US had all the cards and China had a bad hand. But, as people joked on social media, China makes the cards. The US has deindustrialized. China is the world's manufacturing superpower, and that's why I'm not surprised at all that China has been winning this trade war. So I think all this explains why Trump ultimately came to this agreement. And let's keep in mind, it was the US that was pressuring China to come to the negotiating table, not vice versa. China was fine waiting longer. It was the US that was increasingly desperate. And as the Financial Times put it, this is simply a 1-year truce. The FT quoted an analyst from the hawkish US think tank CSIS, which, by the way, is an anti-China think tank. They're not in any way pro-China. But this analyst acknowledged that China's President Xi, quote, stared down Trump and Trump blinked. Xi has mastered managing Trump. Meeting U.S. threats with larger threats has gotten Washington to back down, end quote. Now, of course, if you listen to Trump, he's claiming the exact opposite. In his typical bombastic fashion, Trump claimed that it was an amazing meeting with President Xi, and he claimed on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, the meeting was a 12. Now, this is because Trump will never admit when he loses. He doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that he started the trade war on China, and yet he has been losing. And this is especially because midterm elections are coming up in the US in just 1 year, in 2026, and Trump and the Republicans are already focusing on those elections. I think this is a big reason why Trump wanted this 1 year truce. I would not be surprised if after the midterm elections, Trump restarts the trade war on China. But Trump was afraid that continuing to escalate the trade war on China would blow back on the US economy and hurt the Republican Party's chances in the upcoming midterm elections, especially because polling by groups like Pew Research shows that the Republican Party and Trump are very unpopular. Although, of course, I should point out that the Democrats are also unpopular. Both parties are very unpopular. The majority of Americans say the Republican Party is too extreme in its positions, and the majority of Americans do not think that the Republican Party governs in an honest way. Although I should point out that they feel the same about the Democrats. I'm not trying to defend the Democrats here. I'm just being objective and looking at the facts, and they show that Trump and the Republicans are simply not popular. In fact, the latest polling from The Economist from the 31st of October found that 284 days into Trump's second term, his net approval rating is negative 18%, and it has continuously fallen throughout Trump's term. Only 39% of Americans approve of Trump's policies. 57%, nearly 3/5 of Americans disapprove of Trump's policies. And it makes sense that most Americans feel this way because Trump's policies have been hurting average working class Americans, especially Trump's tariffs. Goldman Sachs published data in October that found that U.S. consumers are bearing more than half of the cost of Trump's tariffs. Economists at this major U.S. bank estimated that U.S. consumers are paying 55% of the costs of these tariffs. Now, Trump has falsely claimed for years that other countries pay tariffs. That's a lie. It is not true. Tariffs are a tax on consumption, and it is importers in the country where the tariffs are imposed that pay the tariffs. So U.S. importers pay the tariffs. Companies in the U.S. that import goods from China pay the tariffs, not China, not Chinese exporters. And ultimately, U.S. importers, U.S. companies, usually they pass down the costs of those tariffs to customers in the form of higher prices. So Trump has been increasing taxes, consumption taxes, on working class Americans with these tariffs, which is a form of regressive taxation. And again, Goldman Sachs estimated that 55% of those tariffs are paid by Americans, and that figure is likely going to increase, especially as Trump imposes more tariffs. So U.S. consumers are going to struggle more and more with higher prices. We've already seen that consumer price inflation in the U.S. has been persistently high. The main measure for this in the U.S. is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and as of September 2025, it was at 3% compared to the previous year. This is significantly above the 2% target that is usually set by the U.S. Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank. And you can see that consumer price inflation has been rising ever since Trump imposed massive tariffs on countries around the world in April 2025. Now, obviously, yes, inflation is not nearly as high as it was in 2022 coming out of the pandemic. It peaked at around 9%, which is likely a conservative estimate. But the point is that inflation in the US has remained hot, and the data shows it's increasing, not decreasing under Trump, which is very ironic because Inflation was basically the main reason that Trump won the 2024 US presidential election. It was not because Americans agreed with all of Trump's very right-wing policies. It was because of the inflation crisis coming out of the pandemic, which was a global inflation crisis, of course, but the Biden administration did not handle it well, especially coming out of the pandemic. The rich have gotten much, much richer, and poor and working class people are struggling. And Trump claimed that he would solve the economic issues and bring down inflation. Of course, he's only made inflation worse. He has not solved these deep economic structural issues. I mean, Trump's policies have benefited billionaires like him, but the Democrats did not actually propose pro-working class policies that would solve these economic problems. So Trump won because he had a simplistic message claiming that he was going to solve all of these economic problems by deporting immigrants, which did not work. It's actually making things worse, and by imposing tariffs, which are also making things worse. In fact, Trump also claimed that he was going to reindustrialize the US and bring back good manufacturing jobs. But in fact, the data shows that in his first year as president, the number of manufacturing jobs has been falling, not increasing. From April to October 2025, 42,000 manufacturing jobs in the US disappeared. And a lot of this is because of the uncertainty surrounding Trump's tariffs and trade war. CBS News reported that for all of 2025, 33,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in the US. And these were jobs making goods like cars, household appliances, and electronics. Many of these were good, well-paid jobs, steady jobs for working class families. And the main reason for the loss of these jobs in manufacturing is uncertainty, again, because of Trump's tariffs. If you look at the data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can see that when Trump entered office in January until April, manufacturing employment was pretty steady. In fact, it slightly increased. And then in April, when Trump started this new trade war, what happened? The number of manufacturing jobs in the US fell significantly, which is the exact opposite of what Trump claimed his tariffs would do. This is yet another example of how Trump's trade war has not been helping average working class Americans. It's been doing the exact opposite. Now, another group in the US that was hit hard by Trump's trade war on China was farmers, especially those who produce soybeans, who rely very heavily on exporting to the Chinese market. Now, as part of the agreement that was made between Trump and China's President Xi in South Korea in October, the Trump administration boasted that China will be buying soybeans from US farmers. Scott Bessent said this was a major victory for the Trump administration and that China will buy 12 million metric tons of US soybeans. That sounds like a lot of soybeans, right? But if you look at the details, what you see is that in reality, this number is actually a decrease compared to what China purchased from US soybean farmers in the prior season. Last season, China bought 22.5 million tons of US soybeans. Now they're going to buy about half of that, 12 million tons. So this is not a major concession here by China. In reality, what happened is that China was already buying soybeans from the US, and then China paused its import of soybeans in response to Trump's aggressive unilateral trade war. And now China is going back to buying soybeans like earlier. So from China's perspective, nothing changed. Trump's trade war did not actually result in any gains for the US, at least in this area. Meanwhile, US farmers have been going through severe economic pain. As Reuters put it, quote, "The drop in Chinese demand cost US farmers, a key pillar of Trump's political base, billions of dollars in lost sales, and the deal would represent a return to normalcy in trade," end quote. So Trump was hurting his own voters. The majority of US farmers voted for Donald Trump. He hurt them, and now we're back to square one, exactly where things were before Trump entered office, before his escalation of this trade war on China. And again, what this shows is that when Scott Bessent claimed that the US held all the cards and China was more dependent on the US, it was actually the opposite of reality. China is less dependent on the US because what China said is fine. We're going to stop importing soybeans from the US, and instead, China massively increased its imports of soybeans from Argentina. China also increased its purchases of soybeans from Brazil, which has become a major ally of China, a major trading partner. Brazil is the B in BRICS. It's one of the co-founders of BRICS. So China has alternatives to the US. Again, the Trump administration, these top US officials drank their own Kool-Aid, which is always very dangerous. And I should point out that this is not surprising at all if you actually study the facts of what happened during Trump's first term when he launched the trade war on China. And what happened? 92% of the tariff proceeds of the revenue that the US government made from Trump's tariffs between 2018 and 2020, nearly all of it, 92% of it, was paid to US farmers as a bailout in the form of subsidies and relief payments. So Trump has claimed that supposedly his tariffs are going to raise all of this revenue, which, by the way, again, I need to repeat this. That revenue comes from American consumers. It is a tax on working class Americans, on consumption. It is a very regressive tax that especially hits poor and working class Americans the hardest because they spend a much larger percentage of their paycheck on basic staples like food compared to rich people who only spend a small percentage of their income and wealth on food. But again, Trump used that revenue during his first term that he raised from tariffs in order to bail out US farmers who were hurt by his trade war. And by the way, the Trump administration has already been talking about another bailout of farmers now during Trump's second term. Trump has been considering a $10 billion bailout for US farmers because they've been hurting due to his escalation of the trade war on China. So once again, when you hear Trump boast about all of the revenue he's raising from tariffs, you need to keep in mind that a lot of that money is actually going to pay bailouts and subsidies because of the damage caused by his trade war. And again, that money is not coming from foreign countries and foreign companies. It's coming from American consumers paying a tax in the form of tariffs. Now, with all of that said, one of the biggest and most important takeaways of China's victory in this round of the trade war is the importance of rare earths. China completely dominates the global rare earth supply chain, including both the mining and especially the processing and refining of rare earths. China made up more than 60% of the mining of rare earths as of 2024 and over 90% of the refining of rare earths. Now, despite the name, rare earths are actually not that rare. They can be found in many countries around the world. But what makes it difficult for other countries to replace China in the supply chain is the processing of rare earths is very labor intensive and it's very complex. And most countries do not have the technology and the supply chains developed needed to actually process rare earths. If you look at a chart visualizing China's dominance in the global production of rare earth metals, I mean, it's just, there's no comparison. No country even remotely comes close. The US role is very minor. In the past few years, especially after Trump launched the trade war against China in his first term as president, the US has increased its share of the global rare earth industry. But again, it's just very minor, and it's going to take many years, if not decades, for the US to try to catch up. Now, when China responded to Trump's aggressive trade war, and in an act of self-defense, China restricted the export of rare earths to the US, that freaked out Washington, and it freaked out the military-industrial complex in particular, because US tech companies, and especially US military contractors, arms manufacturers, are very dependent on China's processing of rare earths. The US military cannot produce the weapons it needs to prepare for war on China without China's rare earths. This is why the US government in the past decade has been pouring resources into try to develop a new supply chain for critical minerals and especially rare earth elements that cuts out China. Because in Washington, hawks are preparing for a potential war with China. And as they prepare for war, they can't be dependent on critical minerals coming from China. As China has shown, if the U.S. attacks China, China can restrict the export of critical minerals to the U.S. and cut off U.S. industry. This was a major Achilles heel that was exposed in the U.S. by Trump's trade war. And if you read the journals and the media outlets of the U.S. military-industrial complex, they acknowledge, U.S. military contractors acknowledge that the U.S. cannot realistically catch up in the production of rare earths. As the U.S. media outlet National Defense put it, the U.S. cannot dig itself out of the critical minerals hole. This is a huge issue. Now, we should always keep in mind here that the reason that China put those restrictions on is because it was responding to U.S. attacks on China. It was the U.S. that started this trade war in Trump's first administration, but the Democrats, Joe Biden, continued the trade war on China that was started under Trump and the Republicans. Unfortunately, the new Cold War, Cold War II, is completely bipartisan in Washington. And let's not forget that it was Joe Biden that put very significant restrictions on the export of advanced technologies and especially semiconductors to the U.S. The Biden administration restricted the export of advanced chips, advanced chip-making tools, and semiconductor technology to China. And the idea in Washington was that this would be China's Achilles heel. They said China will not be able to catch up to the U.S. in new cutting-edge industries, especially artificial intelligence. U.S. big tech corporations in Silicon Valley will have a monopoly on AI. China will be left behind. That is, of course, not what happened. Now, just as China's restrictions on the export of rare earths have caused the U.S. government to pour resources and to develop its own supply chain for critical minerals, the same thing has been happening with semiconductors. The U.S. restrictions on the exports of semiconductors to China have inspired China to massively develop its own domestic chip-making industry. And now China is dominating the global chip market. So yes, China has not caught up in the most advanced chips, but China is dominating what are known as legacy chips, which are the chips used in most everyday technologies. Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, who was waging this trade war and tech war on China in the Biden administration, she acknowledged in 2024 that around 60% of all new legacy chips coming into the market in the next several years will be produced by China, the majority of chips. And the Chinese government has made this a huge priority through its industrial policy, through its state-led campaign to move up the value chain and to produce higher value-added, more advanced semiconductors. This is why the Chinese government has restricted Chinese tech companies from buying chips from the U.S. company NVIDIA, which is now, the biggest company in the world by market capitalization, now with over a $5 trillion market cap, which is crazy because NVIDIA basically has a monopoly on these most advanced chips. So now the Chinese government has been saying, we're going to pour resources and government support to develop our own advanced semiconductors. And this is at the heart of China's new 5-year plan. China, it does have a market economy, but it has a socialist market economy with key parts of the economy publicly owned by the government. And still, there are elements of planning that are used, especially in strategic industries. Every 5 years, the Communist Party issues a new 5-year plan. And the latest 5-year plan for 2026 to 2030 heavily emphasizes the importance of technological upgrading, moving up the global value chain. And in particular, the new 5-year plan calls for extraordinary measures to have new breakthroughs in advanced chip production. And if you look at China's past planning, its past goals, it has met the vast majority of those goals. A good example of this is the Made in China 2025 initiative. This was a plan announced back in 2015, and the Chinese government set goals to become globally competitive in many important tech industries. And Bloomberg concluded that China was very successful in almost all of the industries it targeted. China is now the global leader in unmanned aerial vehicles, that's drones, solar panels, graphene, high-speed rail, and electric vehicles and lithium batteries. And China will soon be the global leader in carriers of liquefied natural gas, LNG. And China is also very competitive globally in the production of advanced drugs, large tractors, machine tools, robots, artificial intelligence, and semiconductors. The only area where China is not yet competitive is commercial aircraft, but China is very likely to catch up in the next few years. So when the Chinese government makes plans, unlike the US government, which almost never actually meets its goals, China usually meets almost all of its goals. Not all of them, it's not perfect, but it comes very close to meeting its goals. This was actually admitted by a Western think tank that is in fact very anti-China called ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. This is a hawkish anti-China think tank that is backed by the Australian military and funded by multiple Western governments. And yet they published a report admitting that China is dominating global technology and scientific research. They concluded, reluctantly, but they concluded that China is currently leading in 57 out of 64 critical technologies. That is 89% of the critical technologies they are tracking, which is an incredible increase in just 2 decades. 20 years before, in the 2003 to the 2007 period, China was only leading in 3 technologies out of 64. Now it's 57 out of 64. And this report, again, it's an anti-China think tank, they warned that the US is in fact losing the strong historical advantage that it had built. Back in the 2003 to 2007 period, the US was leading in 60 out of 64 technologies. Now the US is only leading in 7 technologies in the 2019 to 2023 period. This is a tectonic shift in just 2 decades. China has become the world's technological and manufacturing superpower, in no small part due to government planning and industrial policy. And yet China continues to advance. China is not just giving up and surrendering to the US in semiconductors and artificial intelligence and commercial aircraft. China also plans on developing very competitive domestic industries in those sectors as well. A key part of its next 5-year plan is what China refers to as, quote, technological self-reliance, end quote. So China will not suffer from the trade war that the US is very likely going to continue. Like I said, this is not the end of the trade war. This is just a temporary truce in this trade war. So you can see why hawks in Washington from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are freaking out about the fact that China has been leading in some advanced industries. And this explains why the US has been so aggressive attacking China in this trade war, in this tech war, that again started under Trump, but also accelerated under Biden. This is bipartisan. So if you look at all of the evidence, it becomes very clear that Trump's trade war has been a failure, especially his trade war against China. Now, he's also waging a trade war against other countries. I don't have time to get into that today, but it is very clear from the evidence that China won this round of the trade war. And again, I want to go back to these absurd comments made by the billionaire hedge fund manager turned U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who claimed that China was playing with a losing hand and the U.S. had all the cards. We can now very obviously see today that that was not true. It is actually the exact opposite. China is less dependent on the U.S. than vice versa. I'm not saying that China is completely independent. It's not. But China clearly won this round of the trade war. The war will still go on, but China has won this battle and Trump lost this battle. On that note, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.